He and Froggy hopped onto Porridge. The horse took a few steps back and then charged toward the castle, jumping over the moat and through the large opening where the drawbridge had been a moment before. The castle's dungeon was small, but it had a row of several small cells. Goldilocks and Red Riding Hood's ropes and gags had been removed, but they were each put in their own cell, mostly so Goldilocks wouldn't kill Red before the wolves had their chance. The huntsman and the huntress watched over them like father and daughter hawks. I just don't understand why my army hasn't rescued me yet. Shouldn't that be their top priority? Red whined. If I were Cinderella, none of this would be happening. I outran your army because, like most things about you and your kingdom, they're slow, Goldilocks said. Besides, they've probably already elected a new queen by now. That's not funny, Red said. This has been the worst day of my entire life. I didn't even know it was possible to be kidnapped twice in one day. The wolves stormed into the dungeon. Red went white with fear. Soldiers are invading the castle, Malumclaw said. We're not waiting for the evil queen any longer. We're taking Red Riding Hood now. Get the queen, the huntsman said to his daughter. The huntress nodded and ran down to the opposite side of the dungeon and up a small stone staircase. She looked back before climbing it, not sure if leaving her father alone was a good idea. No, Red screamed. You can't let them take me. She looked all over the dungeon, unsure who she was talking to. She didn't have any friends in here. I'm ready for this to be over. I'm ready for this day to be over. Fine, you can take her, the huntsman said to the wolves. He unlocked her cell, and Red jumped up and pushed the door open, knocking the huntsman back into the wolves. She ran as fast as she could down the other side of the dungeon and up the stone staircase the huntress had climbed. After her, Malumclaw ordered, and he and his pack ran after the young queen. She managed to get a head start as the wolves had trouble fitting into the staircase. Moments later, Jack and Froggy emerged into the dungeon. Jack was wielding Goldilocks' sword. Stand back! Jack yelled at the huntsman, who backed into a corner with his hands up. Jack, Goldilocks said, clutching the bars of her cell. What are you doing here? Porridge found me, Jack said. I knew something must be wrong because you weren't with her. She led me here, and I met up with Snow White's army on the way. They stared at each other so lovingly that it made Froggy uncomfortable. Splendid. I'll find Queen Red Riding Hood and the twins while you reunite, he said, and hopped back in the direction they'd come from. The huntsman pulled a crossbow out from his fur coat. Jack, watch out, Goldilocks screamed. The huntsman began shooting arrows at Jack. He ducked and dived, barely eluding them. Goldilocks had to dodge the arrows too. They were ricocheting off the stone walls in every direction. The huntsman moved like a machine, reloading his crossbow instantaneously each time he fired. Goldilocks picked up an arrow that had landed near her and began picking the lock of her cell with the arrowhead. Jack was trying to block the arrows with the sword. It was getting harder. The arrows were coming at him much faster. He hit one perfectly, and it flew behind the huntsman. The huntsman grunted and froze. His eyes bulged, and he fell flat on his face. The arrow had bounced off the wall behind him and was now sticking out of his back. The huntsman was dead. Jack, behind you, Goldilocks said. Jack turned around, and the huntress stabbed him in the arm with her dagger. She had seen the whole thing. Ah, Jack screamed. He dropped the sword and fell to the ground. He crawled across the floor and sat himself up against the wall. He was clutching his arm. Blood was everywhere. The huntress walked toward him with her dagger raised. She didn't speak, but she had pure rage in her eyes. As far as she was concerned, Jack had just killed her father. She swooped toward him for a fatal strike. Goldilocks blocked the dagger with her sword. She had picked the lock of her cell and repossessed her sword just in time to save Jack's life. I think it's time you and I had a little girl talk, Goldilocks said, and kicked the huntress in the stomach. The huntress rolled to the other side of the room and hopped back to her feet. Goldilocks and the huntress circled each other for a moment. They stared each other down, waiting for the other to make the first move. Goldilocks swung her sword at the huntress, and the duel began. The huntress only had a dagger, half the size of Goldilocks, but she used it well. Goldilocks had finally found her match. They moved all around the dungeon, each shielding offensive strikes from the other. The huntress cornered Goldilocks. Goldilocks ran up the wall and flipped over the huntress, cornering her now. "Where did you learn to do that?" Jack asked. "I'll tell you later," Goldilocks said. The huntress headbutted Goldilocks and ran out of the dungeon. "Come back here," Goldilocks called out and chased after her. They continued their fight throughout the castle.